Hello there, so I'm inviting you on a journey with me, yet more about the nature of reality. And this time I'm looking particularly at the bizarre aspects of the nature of reality. Like, for example, there's a guy called Bruce Lipton who wrote a book called The Biology of Belief. And his point is that our belief systems make such a huge impact on the nature of our existence that they can change our reality. And a really extreme example about this is an illness. Somebody can get an illness. And let's take it back even further. A person can develop some symptoms which they then begin to start to tell themselves a story about these symptoms, and they craft this story about there being something wrong, and that therefore they need to go to a medical practitioner and find out what's wrong and put things right. Now, in really extreme examples, people do go for tests. In fact, people who are totally healthy go for tests, and sometimes medical practitioners find something wrong. And when that happens, the person's belief system adapts and adjusts to this change in circumstances, and they literally bring that illness into existence. So that's one really bizarre thing about the nature of reality. But the other equally bizarre thing is that there are people who completely the opposite, have no thoughts or awarenesses about any illness at all, and are absolutely fine. And all of a sudden something develops, and for them it seems like out of the blue, and then they go for tests and discover a very advanced form of whatever it is, and they've got only a short time to live. So all this has really got me going about, well, what is objective and what is subjective? So here's a really extreme example of something objective. Objectively, if someone detonates a nuclear bomb, then people are going to die of radiation poisoning within a certain distance of that blast. And that seems to be a fact, that seems to be objective reality. But then here's an odd one. As we all know, in Japan, at the end of World War II stopped by two atom bombs being dropped by the Americans onto Japan, one into Hiroshima and the other to Nagasaki. Now, the Nagasaki bomb is particularly interesting in terms of what happened, because when that bomb exploded, there were two hospitals, and they were pretty much the same distance away from the blast site. And what was very strange is that in one of the hospitals, everyone got radiation poisoning and died. And the other hospital, they all survived. So what on earth is going on here? It's got nothing to do with belief. The only difference between these two hospitals is that the hospital where everyone died from radiation poisoning, they were operating the hospital using modern allopathic medicine, pharmaceutical drugs and all the rest of it. The other hospital was using traditional Japanese medicine practices. Now, what's really significant is the food that was served in the hospitals. In the first one, the allopathic hospital, they served Western style food. In the traditional hospital, they served traditional Japanese food, and big ingredients was sea vegetables, what we call seaweeds. Lots of seaweed in the food and lots of miso. So that was the thing that was correlated eventually. So this traditional Japanese diet with lots of seaweeds, sea vegetables, miso, pumpkin, vegetables, rice, that kind of stuff, fish, they survived, and the others died. So what does that tell us about the nature of reality? It's a bit of an odd one, isn't it? So here's another one. 20 years ago, hard to believe I can actually say this now, finally, 20 years ago, I entered into an intimate relationship with one plant spirit, which is called Salvia divinorum. It's what we will call a psychoactive plant spirit. It's actually sage. Salvia divinorum means divine as sage. And 20 years ago, it was very easily obtainable, completely legally. Now, in most countries, you'd have a job to find it. And I got hold of the times 10 extract, which actually, as extracts go, was a very mild one. And at that point, they were having up to times 40. But times 10 was absolutely fine. I did the pranayama breathing, the full inhalation, hold your breath as long as you can, full exhalation, hold as long as you can. Did that for 10 minutes. Got out the bong, had one hit of this Salvia divinorum extract, really small amount. 3, 2, 1, and my entire perception of what I call the consensus reality vanished. I was sitting in my geodesic dome at the time. I was running a camp with a group of people, and everyone had gone home, the punters that is, and so I thought, right, it's an opportunity to do this Salvia divinorum. So I did all what I just said. So everything disappeared. There was no geodesic dome, there was no floor, there was no ceiling, and there was no me. And particularly interesting, no access to the mind. So my I am presence is there, and everything's gone, and I'm perceiving something entirely different. I'm perceiving moving shapes of different colours, very tiny little shapes, and they have a very particular shape. And the shape they have, I'll draw it for you. That's the shape, and that is a shape that you find where Salvia divinorum actually comes from. It's a very unusual plant because it doesn't grow out in nature, it only grows in temples. It's the only place anyone can find it these days, and it only grows in very low light conditions. Put a Salvia divinorum plant in the window and it dies. I grew a lot of these plants at one particular time. I just got one plant and ended up with 30 vibrant plants, about 6 foot tall, fantastic plants, beautiful. So that was it. So I couldn't think, there was no mind, and I couldn't perceive any of the consensus reality, but there was this shape, and there were these tiny coloured shapes that looked something vaguely like letters, but not exactly. And then as I got deeper into it, I became aware of these tiny beings, and there's a very particular shape. They had this shape. That's the shape they had, like that. Also iridescent, multicoloured, shiny, vibrant, moving. Everything was moving. And the first opportunity I had to perceive anything other than what I was witnessing, entire consensus gone, body gone, mind gone, these beings, this shape, I then perceived a communication between these beings, and one of the beings says to the other being, "What's he doing here?" Obviously referring to me. So that was a very memorable thing. And the other thing to point out is I was in a space of no time. Time didn't exist. So there was no ability to perceive time duration whatsoever, simply wasn't there. And after what was for me an eternity, there was suddenly, my I am presence suddenly was able to re-access my mind. And my very first thought is, how do I ever get out of this? That's it, just that one thought, that was all. I can't say I was frightened, but I was definitely disturbed, that's what I would say. So disturbing. How do I get out of this? More, no time elapsed, more of eternity. The next thing that I was aware of is I was aware that I was able to think, and I was aware that I had eyes, and I was aware that I had a body. And I moved my head down, I looked at my body, and I could see my foot and my ankle, I could see the top of my thigh, but the calf at the bottom of the thigh and the knee simply wasn't there. There was just a space. And instead of that part of the body being there, I could see right through it, and I could see the floor underneath, the Turkish rug. And that was a really interesting experience. So I was only partly back. And I processed the fact that I wasn't completely back. And then when I looked again, my body had returned. So what on earth does this tell us about the nature of reality? One of the messages I got in my integration is reality is a construct. Everything we perceive, the rug I'm sitting on, the altar, the candle, these are all constructs. And if 50 people were to crowd into this room, everyone would say, yeah, there's a candle, it's lit, there's an altar, there are 2 athames on the altar, there's a pyramid, there's a singing bowl, all the rest of it, there's feathers. So we all would agree that's what's there. And yet, when I imbibed this plant, the entire consciousness reality had vanished. And I did eventually discover when I came back, when I finished coming back, and I was able to move my body, I was able to pick up a device, I discovered that about 8 minutes had elapsed, which was very, very amusing to me at that point, as you can probably imagine. So what is this? What's this all about? It seems that some things, like an accident, a car collision, for example, that's reality. A bomb dropping, that's reality. But even with that atomic bomb, there's people in one hospital, they all died, the hospital, they all survived. Something to do with what they were eating was different. What does this tell us about reality? What does this tell us about belief? And my most famous example, of course, the woman I was married to was told by a anthroposophical doctor that she had a strongly predominant precancerous condition, and she spent the next 25 years of her life proving its truth. Before that, she was fine. She had no symptoms except a tiny, tiny little lump that she was only just able to notice in her breast, which is why she'd gone to see a doctor in the first place. But the whole horror of the next 25 years of her life, the drama, the hell of the illness, that all followed on from taking that belief system in. Now, I'm very grateful for a writer. My niece Corinna, I'm so grateful. She's introduced me to this writer. She's called Lucinda Riley, in this book called Missing Sister. So I'm introducing this to you because it's a woman and she writes fiction, and it's set in a contemporary period, but the characters in the book are adopted, and their mission, it becomes clear at a certain point when their adopted father dies, is to go and find out their history, their ancestry. Where was I born? What can I find out about my mum and my dad? So in this particular book I just read, the woman in question ends up in Ireland because she discovers that's where her ancestors come from. And what is so wonderful about the book is you then get taken out of the story you're in and you get plunged into a story from the past. And this one is going back a long time, to the early part of the 20th century, to Ireland when there was the revolution, which eventually resulted in the majority of Ireland becoming its own separate country, while the Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, to this day. And there was something that was so helpful about the book, because what this writer does is she gives you a fascinating story, but then she gives you a whole load of history lessons. So this is a lot of history lessons about what went on in the revolution in Ireland. And my goodness me, it's such an interesting story, because the things I knew a fair amount about the revolution in Ireland, but there was a lot I had yet to learn. She's a woman who does all her research, goes to the best possible sources that she can find. So all her stories are based upon what happened when it's the historical stuff. So there's a very famous person called Michael Collins, and he was effectively the leader of this revolution. And it was rather like David and Goliath, rather like North Vietnam against the Americans in the Vietnam War also in the 20th century. Everyone would be completely convinced, well, of course, North Vietnam doesn't stand a chance, the Americans are going to trash them. Exactly the opposite happened. And they were victorious, and Vietnam is to this day a communist country. And the Americans had their asses kicked, and they were kicked out, despite having overwhelming superiority of firepower, food, weapons, everything. I'll tell you, this nature of reality is really bizarre when you get into it. So here's the thing. The partisans, the revolutionaries, the rebels, they're fighting the British Empire, which at that point, in the teens of the 20th century, 1916, 1917, that kind of time, when we had the Russian Revolution, same kind of time. Well, that was a really, really significant time. So they are facing the night with the British Empire, upon which the sun supposedly would never set. Infinitely powerful, occupied many, many countries in the world. The world map became pink, which is the colour that the geographers used to show the British Empire. The Irish had so few resources, and they were given a very hard time by the British. They were terrorised, they were given a really hard time. I want to make a slight sidebar onto this, because here is something about the nature of reality. If you go to Ireland and ask anyone about the Black and Tans, then this provokes a deep ancestral reaction, because it was a horrific thing. What happened is, at the end of World War One, when that war ended in an armistice, the British left France, British Army left France, and went back to England. And what happened is that the elite, which are the people that control the governments of the world, in this case the elites that control the British government, what they did is they decided that they would recruit some of the soldiers who survived World War One. Now, I've also done my research about World War One, and that was the first of the wars where the horror was turned up to a new level altogether. So the soldiers, any soldier who'd been in World War One, who'd seen any action at all, had been traumatized to, for us, an unbelievable extent. We can't even begin to imagine the horrors and the traumas that they went through. And some of them went through it for years. So what they did is they recruited some of the survivors of World War One, and they had one thing in common. They had all experienced unspeakable trauma, which means effectively that they had been broken, and that they were all carrying massive amounts of repressed anger, seeing their compatriots blown to smithereens, injured and dying horrible deaths, sometimes for years. So they recruited some of these people, and this is also something to be aware of. Usually, at the end of a war, the soldiers go home, and the so-called victorious side, if there's a victory, the soldiers are usually treated like trash, usually given very little consideration, and they often subjected to extreme hardships, including poverty and starvation, as well as, of course, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health issues and all the rest of it. So what the elites did, using the British government as their tool, they recruited these soldiers and they put them into a bizarre uniform. The lower half of the body was dressed military, the upper half was dressed like a policeman. And they sent them to Ireland with one purpose only: to terrorise the civilian population of that entire country. And that's what they did. And I won't go into any of the details of exactly what they did, but a reign of terror was perpetrated against the Irish people. And I mean specifically the civilians, and I include the women, the children. And they would simply turn up in their vehicles, and the Irish eventually realised that they had to have people to look out and they would have to flee, because if they didn't, they'd be subjected to unspeakable barbarism and brutality. Now, the book doesn't talk about the elites, but this is a bit that I was able to pick out. I was able to realise, because she talked about the fact that they were recruited to do these things. Because the thought had often been in my head, okay, what is it that would cause a person to do that? Well, of course, the whole World War I was a psyop, mind control operation, and anyone that survived was permanently damaged and would do whatever they were told, frankly, because they had all that reservoir of suppressed anger they wanted to let out, and they would let it out against whoever, because that's what that level of trauma does to a person. So I was grateful to understand that. But getting back to Michael Collins, he was a revolutionary leader, and they were having such a hard time, the Irish, and the rebels were struggling. They would occasionally have small victories, and they were very skillful in their ability to wage a guerrilla war. They had no training. These were ordinary people, teachers, builders, labourers, farmers, who left their jobs and were suddenly waging a war against the might of the British Empire. How to imagine? This is all very significant for us to be aware of in these times that we're living in. I'll simply say that. So, using their intelligence and being cooperative and having gone through terrible struggles, they finally realised the best thing they could do would be to find the highest ranking person who's living in Ireland and who has allegiance to England and the Crown, and kidnap them and hold them ransom. And one of the reasons they need to do this is because what was happening is that the British government was, whenever they caught the rebels, they would put them in prison and they would execute them. And they wanted to stop their people from being murdered by the British government, completely understandable. So they thought, well, if we can capture a really high-ranking one of theirs, preferably military, in brackets, preferably military with allegiance to the elite, then that would be a game changer. And they eventually succeeded. I can't tell you the name of the man, but he was a lord, and he had a very, very high military ranking, and they finally got one. And they actually kept him in a very strange and significant place. They kept him in a crypt. Basically, that's where people who are better off, they die, and they put them in these little mausoleums, a hole in the ground. So he was kept in this hole in the ground. And unlike the way that the British government treated the Irish, whereby in prison their conditions would be appalling, they did everything they could to make sure he was given the best treatment they could do, make sure he had plenty of food, best food they could give him. They wanted to really go over the top, not to follow in the footsteps of the ones who were oppressing them. So this disturbed the elite so much, because one of theirs was now in the control of the rebels. And the rebels says it's simple. you kill one more of our volunteers in prison, we're going to execute him. Well, the elites love their own, and after due consideration, they capitulated and they surrendered to the Irish Revolutionary Volunteers. Can you imagine such a thing? The might of the British Empire overcome, or so it seemed. So there we are. Michael Collins is a victor. He's a leader of this Irish Republican Army, as it probably would have been called at that point. And so what then happens is Michael Collins and his deputies were invited to London to negotiate the terms of the treaty, because this was going to be an Irish Free State. That's what they were negotiating. That's what they were fighting for, independence. Now here's the thing. In the book, Lucinda Riley makes it really clear that when Michael Collins returned from England to Ireland, he then did something which was completely incomprehensible to the Irish people. He accepted a peace deal which basically meant that rather than Ireland becoming a free country, it would become an autonomous dependency of the Crown with its own government. So in other words, Ireland would have its own government, but in terms of military matters, it would still be part of the British Empire. That was the point, be part of the British Empire. And a chunk in the northeast of the country would not be part of this. They would stay part of the British Empire completely. Now, nature of reality, this is pretty weird stuff, isn't it? He agreed to terms that, frankly, no sane Irish person wanted to accept. What on earth had happened? Well, if that wasn't bad enough, Ireland then found itself in a situation where Michael Collins was funded to create the Irish National Army. And guess where the funding came from? Yes, it came from the British government, from the British Empire. Stranger and stranger. And then what happened is this Irish National Army, it was well known because, of course, Michael Collins, all these people that were until very recently revolutionaries, who now were in charge of a national army, funded by the British government. Can you imagine all this? Very strange. They knew that they couldn't just arrive in a normal way, because the whole of the country was up in arms against this peace deal, and there'd be loads and loads of revolutionaries who would not accept it, and they were armed. They knew all this. So what happened is the British government provided them with boats, so they were able to make a landing with boats in the middle of nowhere on the beaches. And this is what happened. I believe it was Cork, and this army then fought a campaign and was very successful because, of course, they were very well armed, and there's a whole bunch of them had been recruited. So you have this Irish National Army attacking the revolutionaries and winning. What a completely bizarre situation. How could this have happened? Well, let's just rewind. Michael Collins ended up negotiating a peace treaty with the British government and came back with the treaty that no one in Ireland wanted, and then got an army and started a war against his own people. Now there's a really very obvious explanation. This is not provided in the book. Everything I've just said, it's in the book, but here we go. Some people think that MK Ultra 1960s is the beginning of mind control. Mind control has always been around, and the elites have always made use of this. And so it's crystal clear to me that he was taken somewhere, things were done to him, and after those things had been done to him, he then took on a completely different worldview, a completely different reality. His reality was now completely different. He'd been created a new reality of, my job is to get the people of Ireland to accept a deal I know none of them want. And so they then had a civil war. That's what was happening. Irish National Army fighting against their own people. But of course it's an incredibly difficult situation because their own people didn't want to fight their own army with their own people, which made it so much easier for the National Army to beat them. Their heart wasn't in it. Until there was a particular occasion, it's getting on towards the end of the book, all 800 pages of this book as well. Michael Collins, he is a West Cork man, and he's now in West Cork with his army, and he feels at home, lets his guard down, drives around everywhere in an open-topped car. Well, you can imagine what happened, can't you? Yeah, someone did take a shot at him, and he was assassinated by one of his own, an Irishman. So that pretty much was the end of the Civil War, and Ireland was pretty much obligated to take a deal which meant that a part of their country would never be theirs, still isn't, and that they would actually be still effectively a vassal state inside the British Empire, but they'd have their own government for their own domestic matters. And that's how that particular mess happened. So the nature of reality, the way someone could literally go to argue and negotiate a peace treaty and come back with something that he knew that none of his people would accept. Which goes to show that when people are dealing with elites, they need to be very careful, because who knows what can happen. And it is one of the tricks of the elites, has been the case right throughout recorded history and beyond, whereby appearing to give the other side a victory causes people to let their guard down, and then through subterfuge it's possible for them to continue pursuing their agenda. So I know this has been a really rambly thing, but my point is about the nature of reality. To what extent is it our belief? How easily are our belief systems moulded by others? To what extent are we susceptible to having our belief systems altered, whether it's by a doctor with a diagnosis, or whether you're a revolutionary leader and you go to negotiate a peace treaty? Yeah. Questions. I've got a lot of questions, but the thing to me about the nature of reality, that's what nature of reality does to me. It provokes questions. And about me and my experience of the whole consensus reality disappearing, and then it gradually coming back piece by piece. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts very early the morning of the summer solstice 2025, Glastonbury.